Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. Confucianism has had an enormous influence on China and its neighboring East Asian countries for centuries. Suppressed during the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't until after Mao Zedong's death in 1976 that Confucianism has slowly returned. And with the recent endorsement by the communist government, Confucianism has once again been embraced in China. Joining me to discuss this revival of Confucianism is Daniel Bell, a professor of philosophy at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and the author of Beyond Liberal Democracy, Political Thinking for an East Asian Context. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, obviously, there's a historical tradition to Confucianism in China, explicitly in relation to imperial governments.
Right.
Why don't we start there to provide some context of, I guess, the role that Confucianism played within the imperial machination or the imperial state?
Yeah, well, Confucianism started before imperial China was created, and the three kind of founding fathers of Confucianism, if you want to use that language, are Confucius, Mencius, and Xunzi, and they were all social critics who criticized the authorities of the day for deviating from what they considered to be ideal forms of government. But then their ideas were, I guess we can say, appropriated and revised somewhat by imperial China, and they're combined with legalism, which is a much very different philosophy, which emphasizes the use of harsh punishments and politics as a mode of social control. So the kind of Confucianism that in imperial China was much more of a mixture with legalism.
Well, and it certainly suggests the idea that given how old Confucianism is as a philosophy, it must be very diverse. There must be many schools within its traditions that argue with each other.
Right.
How is this, I guess, to bring us into the modern day, what kind of Confucianism or what style of Confucianism is emerging in modern China?
Well, there are different styles, if you want. One of them, we can call it popular Confucianism, and there's this book by a female scholar called Yu Dan, which it's a book on the Confucian Analects, and it's sold about 10 million copies.
Wow.
And that's the equivalent of what we can call it a self-help book. I mean, people compare her
like
ideas.
Confucius for Dummies, sort of.
Right. And it very much downplays the critical side of Confucianism and the emphasis, the importance of social responsibility and political commitment. And it's more about how we should deal with other people on an everyday level. And it has some useful insights, but it's only part of the story. And then there's this, we can call it the more academic revival. And this is the Confucian texts being taught in schools. And more now, there's this revival of the Confucian classics. It's being taught not just in kind of official schools, but also we can use the language of civil society. I mean, it's educational institutions that are teaching the Confucian classics to kids. I mean, even in my case in Beijing, we found it as he's a lawyer trained at Tsinghua and my university, and just because he wants to revive the classics, he's doing these classes on the weekend for kids. So I'm sending my kid there. Just an example. I mean, there are thousands of such cases.
Well, and it strikes me in the context of rapid economic growth that at the same time yields really a lot of social displacement and a lot of social unrest, that Confucianism offers not just the Communist Party, but individuals a way of, I guess, achieving some sense of personal order or family order or a larger social order. Am I correct in seeing that appeal?
Yeah, so the government views it as a way of, the government used the language of harmonious society, which owes a lot to Confucianism. And in a way, it's a recognition that society is not so harmonious. The question is, how do we deal with the conflict? And under the previous Maoist regime, we would use the language of a violent class revolution. But now, Confucianism says we should use peaceful means as a way of dealing with social conflict. Now, why is it being revived at the popular level? I think partly it's that with modernization, people become much more individualistic, and I think most people they want to be good. They want their life to have meaning beyond just whatever, just making money for their own material well-being. And I think Confucianism provides some sorts of insights into how life could be more meaningful in that respect.
Well, and it also strikes me, I guess, from the perspective of the ruling regime and the Chinese state, that as they reach a position of prominence within the global economy, Confucianism represents, at least mythologically, a sense of their imperial greatness and their moral greatness. Do you feel that that's part of a motivation in terms of how the Communist Party explicitly is looking at Confucianism?
Yeah, I mean, Confucianism, it is true that it's a more universal philosophy. I mean, like liberalism, it's meant not just to appeal to one particular country, but to have universal value. So now the government is using these Confucius institutes as a way of promoting Chinese culture and language. So far, it's mainly promoting Chinese language. Yeah, so...
Well, and it's interesting, I read in one of your columns that you suggested that in the near future, it's not ludicrous to suggest that, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party may change their name to the Chinese Confucian Party.
Yeah, well...
Is that crazy? I mean, how plausible is that?
Well, perhaps it's not that plausible for the moment, but who knows what's going to happen in the future. And certainly, communism has lost the kind of moral legitimacy that it used to have. And I think the government, if it wants to maintain in power, has to appeal to some other philosophical foundation to justify its existence. And
well, and there has to be a coherence, given, I mean, I studied political theory in university and was a communist activist for a part of my youth. And I look at the Chinese state and they don't really appear very communist to me at all. But my understanding of Confucianism suggests that they do seem much more Confucian than communist.
Right. Well, I mean, there's some overlap, like the idea that the government has a very important obligation to secure the material well-being of the people. It's not just communist state, that it has a long history in Confucianism too. The idea that it's that people are more kind of secular, you know, I think that's both a kind of communist and Confucian idea. But there's still a lot of tension. I mean, I think Confucianism emphasizes moral education and moral example as a way of persuading the people rather than relying on coercion. And certainly the Chinese Communist Party, as we know, has tended to rely on coercion as a way of securing its goals. So to the extent that it adopts the language of Confucianism, you know, if it's faithful to Confucianism, it needs to rely more upon moral education and persuasion as a way of securing its goals.
Unfortunately, we have to take a break. But when we come back, let's talk more about, I guess, Confucianism as being an alternative to liberalism, I guess, as a form of governance in the East. I'm speaking with Professor Daniel Bell from Tsinghua University in Beijing. We'll be back with more on this topic right after the break. You're watching 3D Dialogue. Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh. And with me in studio is Professor Daniel Bell of the Philosophy Department at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And he's also the author of Beyond Liberal Democracy, Political Thinking for an East Asian Context. Now, certainly that book title suggests to me that Confucianism really offers a viable Eastern alternative to the pressures that certainly Western governments are pressing in terms of the emergence of liberal democracy in China. Perhaps you could articulate, I guess, the juxtaposition or the alternate of Confucianism compared to liberal democracy.
Right. I mean, I think there are a few points of tension, and one of them is this idea that politics should be for the people. And I think liberal Democrats and Confucians agree with that. But then the question is, which people? And for Democrats, the government's responsibility is towards the electorate that votes for it. And I think for Confucianism, that's important, but it's a limited vision, because the purpose of government is not just to secure the interests of the voters, but also to secure the interests of future generations and
much more forward-looking.
Right, and also backwards-looking, maintain historical continuity with what our ancestors did, and also looking outside the country toward. I mean, Confucianism is a universal ideal, and the purpose of government is to secure the interests not just of the people in one country, but to secure the interests of those who are affected by the policies in other countries.
So it's a more holistic approach to government.
A more holistic and one that is perhaps less limited than democracy.
Well, and especially as you said, this notion of supporting those who voted for you. Often in Western societies, that's less than 25% of the population. going back to the way, I guess, Confucianism could impact governance within China, historically there was a meritocratic system in which there was exams that supposedly meant those with the greatest ability rose up within the civil service. Do you envision such an approach being adopted within China, I guess, going away from party loyalty and party work to more towards merit and more towards a system based on ability?
Right. I mean, exams, they give an equal opportunity for everybody to participate in government. And if the exams are well crafted, at least in theory, they could test for certain virtues that we want political decision makers to have. So that's why some people who are thinking of how to revive Confucianism today are thinking of models of government. For example, maybe having one democratic house and one more meritocratic house, which would be composed of decision makers who are selected by a free and fair examination process. And their task would be to think not just about the interests of the people who vote for the decision makers in the democratic house, but to think more globally about issues, you know, like environmental issues and the interests of future generations and the interests of foreigners and the interests of minorities. And that sort of meritocratic institution might have a lot of legitimacy in the Chinese context, given that there is this history of using examinations as a way of selecting decision makers.
And it strikes you, as you were describing that sort of outward look or that international look, there are a lot of, I would assume, regional powers as well as global powers who are nervous about China's ascendancy. And it strikes me that if they would articulate that notion of Confucian values, it would perhaps allay people's fears and make them more comfortable. Is there a type of Confucianism, given its diversity, that you feel is most appropriate to China's needs, both internally and within the world stage?
Well, there are many different schools of Confucianism, but to my mind, the most defensible is one that kind of tries to combine socialist and Confucian ideals. And there's one thinker called Ganyang who has put forward this idea of a Confucian socialist republic. And here the idea is we need to draw upon a socialist concerns for the disadvantaged in society, but also think of using Confucian values as a way of promoting that. So, for example, you know, social hierarchy is inevitable in most societies, but the question is, how can we make those hierarchies work for the interests of the disadvantaged? And that's sort of question that liberals tend not to ask, but in societies with a Confucian heritage, it's very important to ask those sorts of questions.
Well, and it also strikes me, both in the way you've described Confucianism in terms of virtue, in terms of morals, that it's different. Here in the West, we not so much take for granted, but we worship the separation of church and state. Whereas you're a political theorist, and here we're on a religious show. Confucianism really seems to blend the notion of politics and religion in a very sober and, I guess, coherent manner. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but also I think Confucianism in Imperial China, certainly if you compare it with the history of you know, the conflict and tensions between religion and politics in Western countries, I mean, Confucianism has been historically tolerant and has drawn upon Buddhist and Taoist insights and has often sought to, you know, rather than affirm Confucian values as against others, but has sought to absorb others. And so those who are proposing, so some thinkers today, like Jiang Qing, are proposing making Confucianism into a state religion, but then they explicitly say that they compare it to a state religion in the UK or Sweden, where it's a religion that maybe has extra resources from the state, but it allows other religions to exist in civil society, you know, without, like in the case of China, Buddhism and maybe Christianity and other such religions.
Although it's interesting to note that certainly the Communist Party has different perspectives on what type of traditions it will allow vis-a-vis its stability. You know, the Falun Dafa or Falun Gong being one example. I personally used to study Taoism, and I'm very fond of Zhuangzi's critiques of Confucius. Could you imagine an opposition to Confucianism, another, I guess, strain from within Chinese philosophy emerging to combat, I get what would be a state power, but could be a mainstream philosophy?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm actually a little bit worried about using the state to promote Confucianism, I mean, yes, it should allow for alternative religious views, including those that are explicitly hostile to Confucianism. But there is a worry that if it's made into an official state orthodoxy, given the recent history of China, especially since the revolution, that it would take more coercive form. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. This has been an excellent introduction for us in terms of the role that Confucianism is playing in modern China, and I look forward to reading more of your work in the future.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for having me.
This has been Professor Daniel Bell of the Philosophy Department at the Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's also the author of Beyond Liberal Democracy, Political Thinking for an East Asian Context. Coming up, a discussion about the role of military chaplains in the Canadian Armed Forces. You're watching 3D Dialogue.